Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for your kind words, and thanks to Gary for inviting me to talk. Gary's asked me to bring a note of depression to the upbeat nature of the day so far, so I've got no money to give away, and I'm not talking about growing in Britain and making more money from your woods in particular. I'm talking about disease and pestilence, so hopefully it won't be too gloomy. So the topic I'm going to talk about is what we should do in our woods of conservation importance in light of cholera. This woodland is, I'm not sure we could call it east of England, but it's certainly in Steve Scott's patch. It's the Derbyshire Dales ash woods, and obviously, you know, we've got a lot of concerns about what happens when cholera hits places like that. But at the moment, you know, right here, we're right in the middle of the cholera outbreak, and I'll be saying more about that. So what I'm going to try and cover is our concerns about cholera, what we're worried about, and our remit for ash. Then look at a study, the results of a study that we've been looking at on the ecological functions of ash and how important it is for our woodlands and possible alternative tree species that might replace ash. And then also look at the effects of climate change on choosing alternative tree species and the importance of woodland structure. And then I'm going to try and bring all that together in a case study that applies some of this thinking to a particular woodland SSI. So in terms of what's concerning us, there's quite a long list. Loss of whole woodland stands where ash dominates, either from tree death from cholera or sanitation or safety felling. Changing tree species composition, which could be a concern, it could be a good thing, via either natural regeneration or planting of new species, and changes that might bring to associated wildlife. And quite a lot of the rest of my talk is going to be around that area. Lack of regeneration of both ash and other trees due to deer browsing and shading out from lack of management and so on. And then loss of ash from the landscapes, so open-grown boundary trees, loss of veteran ash trees, which are very important in some cases, and loss of ash coppice and the associated wildlife with those. So overall landscape change, and ash is a very important tree. I think it's the third most common tree in England, I think, something like that. Tree safety and impeded access to our woodlands is also a concern. And then finally, a sort of broad brush impact on timber value, which may lead to less woodland management, question mark, although Freddie's talking later about making money out of ash, so that's good. And possible loss of confidence in new woodland planting. I mean, ash is one of the most common planted tree species, and also it's one of the most common species that might regenerate naturally on restored ancient woodland sites that had been planted with conifers. So in terms of Natural England's remit for ash, we own and manage a number of national nature reserves. At least 49 of them are of high importance for ash. These are just some examples around the country, and these are some comments from the site managers and concerns that they've raised in terms of ash. So I'll just let you read through those if you can see them at the back. I'm not sure if you can. Also, Natural England is responsible for designating and for the management of SSIs. There's at least 665 woodland SSIs. That's half of the woodland SSIs, which contain significant, you know, ash as a significant feature. This map shows where those SSIs are, the green, two different shades of green reflecting different woodland vegetation types. And the red dots are the 10 kilometre squares where cholera currently is, and that was from last week's map of where cholera is. That's cholera from the wide environment rather than from nurseries. So we can see from here we're right in the thick of it. Natural England's one of the other functions is the environmental stewardship scheme, particularly higher level scheme, and since 2005 we've planted about 800,000 trees in about 3,500 agreements, and we reckon that around about 20% of all the trees that have been planted will have been ash. So we need to consider what we'll do on our own estate with our national nature reserves, and can it contribute to sort of wider learning and practice. Looking at SSIs, what advice we can give to SSI owners, what we can consent in terms of ash felling and replacement species and so on, and how we'll assess condition following ash dieback, looking at advice to agri-environment agreement holders in terms of replacing lost ash trees that have been planted through the scheme, and then wider input that we have to, for example, England Woodland Grant Scheme and other ancient woodland management and advice. So key questions for us have been really, how will Killara impact wildlife in woods that have ash? How we can make these woodlands more resilient to Killara and also to the other wide range of tree diseases that we've got affecting our woodlands. And how does all that fit with managing woods for timber? So the main principles are around diversifying tree species composition and woodland structure, and also reducing other pressures that are acting on woodland, particularly deer browsing, shading, and invasive species. So the rest of the talk is really focused around trying to address some of those questions. So about this time last year, we joined up with the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, Forestry Commission, and the other UK countryside agencies to look at how important ash is in terms of ecology of woodlands and what trees might provide useful alternatives. The James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen did the work for us along with Forest Research, and it actually revealed some quite surprising results in that ash, in fact, is a tree that has some quite unique ecological functions. In particular, the leaves, ash is quite a deep-rooting tree, and the leaves that fall from ash fall with without the nutrients being taken back into the tree, and therefore the leaf litter has a high nutrient content. So it's almost like a fertilizer of woodlands, ash is, and it's hard to work out from that what actually the results from that will be if we lose a tree that does that. And it has very highly degradable leaf litter, much more so than a range of other trees down the bottom. So it's the highest leaf decomposition rate of any of the trees that we looked at. And that, of course, has knock-on effects to other parts of the ecosystem. And this diagram is just trying to illustrate that in terms of, it's quite an important function, and what would happen without that function in woodlands, we're not quite sure. So then we looked at, well, what wildlife is actually associated with ash trees in particular. And there's around about 106 species that rely directly on ash trees. So they either depend on ash completely or they're highly associated with it. And then there's other groups of species which are frequent users of ash in that they use ash in preference to other trees. And then again, another set of species which will use ash alongside other trees. And then there's quite a few that we don't know enough about. So then we tried to have a look at, well, what use do these ash-associated species make of other trees? And this is a list of other trees that we looked at. So it was quite a big list of both native and some non-native trees as well. And in terms of the results from that, we found that some of the tree alternatives were good for certain groups of ash-associated species. So the bryophytes and lichens that live on ash are associated with other trees that have similar bark qualities. So bark pH on ash is quite high, similar to sycamore and hazel. Conifers were, probably not that surprisingly, not that good for ash-associated species. So yew and Douglas fir, pretty poor in terms of providing an alternative to ash. And then oak, good old oak, was very good for quite a number of the species that are associated with ash. So really a conclusion from that, which wasn't surprising, but it's quite good to have some evidence, is that growing mixtures that provides a range of the different species would be good for ash-associated wildlife. So another thing that this study did was look at similarities with other trees on the traits of ash. So we looked at a whole load of different tree traits, ranging from things like bark acidity and mycorrhizal function of trees to, when seeds are released and so on. And that found that some trees are very similar to ash in individual aspects, but actually no trees are that similar to ash overall. And the most similar trees were alder and aspen, and the least similar were sweet chestnut and Douglas fir. So the conclusions were really that of the, ash has this kind of ecological extreme function, as it were, as a native tree species, and no other trees are actually that similar to ash. So there's nearly 1,000 species that are associated with ash, and 10% of those are, dependent on ash. So it's likely that we will lose some of these if we lose ash from our woodlands. So before we go choosing alternative species to replace ash, we need to consider future climate resilience of them. And we've been doing a little bit of work on this over the summer. We've had a student working with us, Catherine Jordan, who was excellent. And what she did was look at, for our major woodland NNRs, I think she looked at 40 woodland NNRs. We ran them through the Forestry Commission's ecological site classification tool. And what that does is show how suitable the site is for a range of different tree species. It shows suitability now and in 2050 and in 2080 using the UK Climate Impacts Programme climate change scenarios. And the species along the bottom, which you probably can't see at the back, are the species that we looked at, which range from birch, sycamore, beech, ash, and so on. So all, quite a suite of the native species with a few non-natives in there as well. This diagram was for Castor Hanglands, which is a oak ash woodland near Peterborough, one of the National Nature Reserves. And the filled-in sort of blue bars are the species that are currently present on Castor Hanglands. And it just shows how each of these species will fare over the next 50 or so years. So basically, it doesn't look great for ash in that scenario. It's not particularly suitable for ash now, and that is actually due to the ecological site classification tool tells you what are the reasons that it will begin to fail or be failing in the future. And for ash, it's moisture stress, which is going to affect it across pretty much the whole of the east of England. Anyway, this is not anything to do with Cholera. But some species like hornbeam and wild service tree do seem to do pretty well pretty much across the whole country. And oak and so on doesn't do too badly. There are some species missing from the FC tool, though, which would have been helpful to have in there, such as field maple. These are some of the maps that we produced from this. So the dots just represent the National Nature Reserves where we did this study. So this is for oak, and actually oak doesn't do too badly in climate change. Basically, dark green is very suitable now or in the future, and the lighter the colour through to red is unsuitable. So oak actually in future climate scenarios doesn't do too badly across the country, really. Aspen is another tree that does reasonably well. It gets slightly less suitable for aspen by 2080. Sycamore is, again, one of the trees that's going to struggle with moisture stress, particularly in the east of England. So we've got these graphs and charts and maps for most of the species, and we're hoping to publish that on our website at some point soon. So ecological resilience is also about getting the structure of woodlands right for wildlife. And we did a look at there's 257 of the about 1,000 species in England of conservation concern. These are called the Section 41 species of Section 41 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So about 25% of the species actually live in woodlands and on trees. And these are the structures of woodlands which they're most associated with. So at the head of the list is veteran trees, which supports a huge number of these species of conservation concern. And then also glades, rides, and edges in broadleaf woodland is next. And then scrub, closed canopy woodland, and clear fell and coppice state structures. So really, woodland management is about trying to get a range of those structures into woodlands. And I just thought I'd show you Emma, my colleague, designed this slide for one of our training courses on woodland structure and what we're looking for. So no loss of woodland area, structure and process, a range of different size of, and deadwood features as well, regeneration, different ages, composition, you won't like this. Shall I do that again? And quality indicators, so looking at what are the particular things. So that's really how we assess woodland condition on SSIs. And SSI woodlands will all have targets to provide a different structural features. So finally, I'm just going to finish up with a case study looking at how we might apply some of that knowledge to a particular woodland. And it starts with doing an assessment of what you've got in your wood. What is the current species composition and structure? What pressures other than tree diseases are acting on the wood? And then look at what are the objectives of the woodland owner and of the SSI or the HLS agreement. And then review this in light of Kalara and develop an action plan. So with what short-term actions are needed, which might include safety felling of diseased trees, improved biosecurity, and so on, reviewing action on other threats and pressures, and then reviewing objectives and important features, and assessing what alternative species might be available to you, and developing a long-term management plan. So case study, we had a question from an agent who is in fact the chair of our session, Mike. This was his question to myself and Emma. I manage a large ancient woodland and SSI, ancient woodland SSI in Suffolk, and it's mostly ash, so what do I do? And we've had that question very many times over the last year for people concerned about woodland SSIs and Kalara. So we went to have a look at the wood with Mike, which is actually very close to here. It's a W8 ash oak woodland with some birch, hornbeam, sycamore, hazel, and some other minor species. And I think that is the thing. A lot of people say my wood's all ash, and in fact, when you're going to have a look at it, there are often quite a number of other species in there too. There was also some coppice, coppice standards, and a range of different structures, but largely it was pretty much single age in some places, and some pause woodland as well. There, as well as Kalara being a threat to the woods, the main pressure actually in the wood was deer management, deer browsing. Large population of red deer, also muntjac and roe. And then squirrels and hares were also quite a big concern in that wood. Past management had reduced the tree species diversity, so largely being favoured for oak and ash. And recent lack of management had led to poor sort of structural diversity in the wood. So the owner was very attached to the woodland and really liked broadleaf woodland. He has a firewood business and hoped to start growing firewood and felling firewood from the wood itself, and also some pheasant shooting. So I think these objectives are fairly standard objectives for a lot of woods in this part of the world. And the SSI was largely an SSI for the white admiral butterfly. It's got the biggest population of white admiral butterfly in this part of the world. The main food plant for that butterfly is honeysuckle. So we thought about an action plan. The site is in the Kalara infection zone, obviously, so there's no point in removing young infected trees. We thought it'd be good to monitor and identify any resistant trees, potentially, as the disease develops in the woods. And probably the biggest priority was to sort out the deer problem with deer management and deer fencing. And then longer term, look to a heavy thinning to favour some of the minor species, so cherry, aspen, birch, hazel, field maple and willow. And then potentially consider planting some oak, small leaf lime and alder. And longer term, move to a more diverse continuous cover forestry system. So hopefully getting both firewood and final timber crop trees out of the woodland as well. The slides at the bottom I've just put in because I mentioned planting in that second bullet point. I think people in the past have thought that we shouldn't be doing planting in woodland SSIs in particular. And this is a picture of a new nursery that we're establishing on one of our national nature reserves to grow some of our own stock for diversification of the tree species. I mean, I think planting does bring risks with it in terms of particularly biosecurity risks, so that's something that we're pretty concerned about. But we have gone down the route of growing our own trees in some of our sites, and that's maybe something to think about. So that's all I was going to say, Mike, and thank you very much.